r/Nosleep. Posted by u/travisliebert. You can find infinite bliss at the center of every wood. But you must follow these rules in order to get there. Part 1. It all started with my Uncle Wayne. Wayne and I had always been close. He was the cool uncle, the one that cursed around me when I was a kid, lost his mind when the ref made a bad call at my soccer games, and slipped me sips of beer at family functions. He was always lighthearted and provided an escape from my relatively strict family. The thing is, Wayne wasn't a happy man. He always tried to hide it, and I didn't notice it when I was younger, but he drifted through life with a subtle emptiness, one he could never seem to fill. As I grew older, he would confide in me more, and sometimes he'd even talk about not wanting to be alive after he had a couple drinks. I'd always admired him for his ability to be loud and outspoken in almost any situation, but he always got quiet when he talked about stuff like that. Then came the suicide attempts. He tried twice in the same year and failed both times. After things had died down and returned to normal, he'd always joked that it was the one thing he was bad at. He got a strange look in his eyes when he said that. Perhaps it was the one thing he wished he was good at. Eventually, he fell on hard times and moved in with my mother and I. That was when I saw the true extent of his sadness. He drifted about the house like a ghost, hardly eating or sleeping. We'd talk and joke around sometimes, but there were entire weeks where he didn't even leave his room. As time passed, he seemed to get even worse, and soon a dark aura hung about him. It weighed down at the edges of his being, seeming only to drag him deeper into despair. One day, he simply disappeared. There was no note, no sign that he'd taken any of his belongings. He just left. Several days passed and our family began to worry. We all thought that he had done something stupid. Maybe he'd finally finished the job. We spent days looking for him. But, with every passing hour, we became even more convinced that we'd never find him. We searched everywhere and even filed a missing persons report. At one point, I recall going down to a nearby river. He'd always liked sitting on the shore and drinking while he watched the sunset. I convinced myself that I was going to see if he was there repeating his usual ritual, but deep down I expected to find him floating among the reeds. Then, 6 days later, he came back. Except, he seemed like an entirely different person. There was no trace of the sadness that had previously haunted him. He looked younger, healthier. His eyes had lost their sunken look and a new fire seemed to burn within them. Every aspect of his demeanor radiated a newfound energy. When we asked where he'd been, he claimed that he'd gone hunting. This was strange, as Wayne had never previously displayed any interest in hunting. I don't even think he owned any guns. But he insisted that he'd simply found a new passion for it. We still didn't quite believe him, but he seemed better. I guess that's all that mattered. From that point forward, he went hunting every month. Each trip lasted 6 days, and he seemed healthier and rejuvenated after each trip. He bought guns, which he left in his truck, but I never once saw him actually pick them up or bother to take care of them. They seemed more like accessories than anything. We figured that hunting was a euphemism for some other activity. Maybe he was partying or had gotten himself tangled up in some kind of affair. Whatever it was, we simply accepted it. All we cared about was the fact that he was better. He no longer drifted about the house aimlessly or went days without eating. You never would have guessed he'd been depressed in the first place. The hunting trips grew more frequent until he was gone pretty much every other week. In the days preceding one of his trips, I'd notice a certain longing in his eyes, as if he was anxious to leave and unwind. My cousin Daniel, an avid outdoorsman, asked to go with him on several occasions. But Wayne always rejected him, claiming that his trips were a private thing. One day, he left for a hunting trip and never came back. At first, we were worried, and that familiar sensation of dread settled in my gut. He'd been so much better lately. I couldn't believe that he'd just disappear like that again. But then a letter came in the mail one day. It was from Wayne, and he claimed that he'd bought a cabin near his favorite hunting spot. He told us not to worry about him, but it was unlikely he'd return. He was simply too happy in the forest, claiming that he wanted to live there for the rest of his life. We all thought it was strange, but he'd always been a somewhat eccentric man. I missed him a lot at first, but he'd occasionally send a letter to keep in touch. There was never a return address, and I never got a chance to actually reply to him. But at least he was still alive. 5 years later, my mother died in a car accident. I was utterly crippled by the incident and spent many days in isolation and grief. I couldn't comprehend life without her, and, for the first time ever, I think I understood how Wayne felt for much of his life. It was almost too much to bear, and I must admit that I considered ending it all. A letter from Wayne arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. Beloved nephew. I was so sorry to hear about my sister's passing. I can't even begin to imagine the pain that you're going through. She was a wonderful woman, and she deserved to live a much longer and happier life. I know we hadn't seen each other in years, but this may be the worst I've felt in a very long time. However, I know that you feel much worse. Life probably seems impossibly bleak to you, and I wouldn't be surprised if you're currently looking for a way out. I've been debating about this decision, but I think it'd be good for you to come and visit. You could use the time away, and I feel that you'll be much happier here in Reverie Wood. If you want to visit, and I'd love to have you, I'll provide some directions below. Below that was a set of directions and a crudely drawn map as well as some notes to help me find my way. A few more lines were written beneath the map. If you follow these directions, you'll find yourself near the edge of the forest. You'll have to park your car here and continue north. Eventually, you'll pass through 2 pillars, at which point you'll find yourself in Reverie Wood. My cabin is located at the center of the forest. It's a 3-day journey by foot, so pack accordingly. There are many things you must know when traversing the wood, but I'm afraid I can't tell you everything. You must discover it for yourself. Best wishes. Uncle Wayne. The letter was strange, to say the least. Beloved nephew? Wayne and I had been close, but I couldn't imagine him ever phrasing things in such a way. Additionally, how had he even heard about my mother's death? No one knew where he lived, and we'd been unable to contact him ever since the day he disappeared. The vague instructions toward the end only made things even more confusing. I grew angry after reading the letter. He'd known about her death, and yet had neglected to come to the funeral. What kind of asshole abandons their own sister like that? Driven by a desire to confront him, in addition to a burning curiosity about his archaic message, I decided to visit. I quickly packed my things, food, a tent, other camping supplies, and several changes of clothes. It was difficult deciding what to bring, as I knew I'd be walking for a long time. I briefly wondered how he'd even managed to move into such a place without being able to get there by car. He'd left all his belongings when he disappeared. Perhaps he was living some strange, minimalist lifestyle. I set out early the next morning. At first, I had trouble following the directions my uncle had given me. They were haphazardly written and often seemed to make no sense. But I eventually found what appeared to be the right place. A gravel road led through a densely forested area, and I drove down it until the path finally terminated in a small gravel parking lot. Several other cars were there, my uncle's among them. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in years, and a thick layer of dust coated it. That concerned me, but at least I seemed to be in the right place. I got out, grabbed my supplies, and began heading north. The trail was largely overgrown, and the foliage only grew denser as I continued. The narrow semblance of a path seemed to be largely untraveled, and I had to pick my way through tangled roots and encroaching briars. After nearly an hour of making my way down the treacherous path, I finally happened upon a clearing. Tall grass waved in the light breeze and sunlight played across the pristine field. I'd grown irritated by the tangled path, but suddenly felt relaxed upon seeing the clearing. It was strangely soothing. 2 massive pillars stood at the other end. They were strangely wrought, seeming to be about 20 feet tall and made of dark, craggy stone. I couldn't tell if they were natural or man-made. There seemed to be no sign of tool use on them, and they defied the typical smoothness of human structures. But surely, they couldn't have come about naturally. This wasn't a mountainous region, and I'd never seen anything like them before. Even the stone was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. I admired them for a while, internally debating the nature of their origin. But I eventually shook myself from my fascination and continued on, passing through the large gap between the stones. A dense huddle of trees stood immediately on the other side, and I sighed as I found myself fighting through their tangled roots and branches. It was even worse than the previous trail. Fortunately, I broke free of the dense grove only moments later and found myself on a dirt path. It continued northward, seeming to wind in an unusual pattern. Additionally, the entire environment had changed. The trees no longer resembled those before, and instead lacked any leaves. It was the middle of spring, and yet none of them had even the slightest hint of green. Their branches curved in a curious fashion, sometimes even spiraling in upon themselves, but the tips of every branch bent at a 90-degree angle. It was as if someone had meticulously taken each one and tuned them so that they were all pointing northward. It felt like they were guiding me. I looked up and noticed that the sky was different too. The vast blue expanse was now tinged with an odd crimson hue, and, I wasn't sure, but it almost seemed like the sun was larger and brighter than it had been only moments ago. I felt like I was in a different world. I considered turning back at that point. An eerie feeling had settled in my gut, and my back prickled as if I was being watched. I quickly whirled around, but there was nothing there, only the dense forest I'd escaped moments ago. Trying to shrug off the sensation, I turned back around and walked northward. The path was practically incoherent. It turned this way and that, sometimes even bending southward for nearly a mile before finally reverting to its original direction. None of it made any sense. What kind of madman would create such a nonsensical path? The sun beat down upon me, and I was growing frustrated with the endless twists and turns. I'd considered just cutting through the trees and heading directly north, but I feared that I would lose my way. Some gut instinct told me that I had to stay on the path. I pulled a bag of trail mix from my pack and promptly spilled most of it on the ground. "Fuck this!" I yelled, finally giving in to the frustration that had been building inside me. That was when I learned the first rule. Rule number 1, always speak softly in Reverie Wood, loud shouts and curses will do you no good. I had just begun to marvel at the absence of any echo from my shout when I felt the ground rumble. It grew until the entire earth trembled with some enormous force. The strange shudders came in waves, pausing for a brief second before the next one began. It almost sounded like something enormous was galloping through the forest. That's when I finally heard the crashing. At first, it was like twigs breaking, but the noise grew louder until it sounded like entire trees were being broken in half. I whirled to face the sound and felt a chill run down my spine at the sight. It was a moose, or at least it resembled a moose. The creature must have been at least 80 feet tall, and it only grew larger as it approached. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I felt myself frozen in place, awed by the sight of the monster. Gargantuan antlers sprouted from its head and great sheets of moss hung from them. Water dripped off it, as if it had just risen from the bottom of some lake. It stopped only a few dozen yards away and sniffed the air, turning its head in several different directions. It made a grumbling noise, like thunder rising from its cavern of a chest. Then, it turned and stared directly at me. That was when I learned the second rule. Rule number 2, never gaze long into the guardian's eyes, lest you fall victim to its wretched lies. Instead of normal eyes, 2 gaping holes of blackness marked either side of the creature's skull. Tissue hung from the rims as if its eyes had been torn out. I stared into those 2 points of blackness, and they stared back at me. Rather, they stared into me. I felt drawn toward them, like my very essence had left my body and been sucked into those eyes. The blackness grew until it encompassed the entirety of my vision. I stood in utter darkness, surrounded on all sides by an endless void of nothing. Then, new shapes came into focus. I'm afraid I must stop writing now. The first sun has dipped beneath the horizon, and the pale men always frown when you work past first sunset. It's best not to make the pale men sad. I will return and tell you more of my tale. Please don't try to find Reverie Wood just yet. You will likely find yourself at the center eventually, but the path to infinite bliss is much easier if you follow the rules I've learned.